She's our tech person. Oh my gosh, already.
Oh, we have to mute.
We're live.
Since we're live, you start.
Well, thank you all for being here. Welcome to our evening together. We're looking forward to spending time with you all. It feels a little bit weird because all I can see are the group of women that we're all speaking with. So I feel like I'm just talking to them instead of all of you, which is disconcerting because of the, faces that they make while I'm speaking. But we'll get through this, Erica, won't we? So we're going to start this evening by introducing ourselves, and Michelle's going to start because she's also going to give a bit of an introduction about how the four of us came together and led to some of these discussions that we're talking about, but that started with writing the chapter in the book that I was there to facilitate the discussion. So Michelle, I'm going to have you start by introducing yourself and giving that little opening. You're muted, Michelle.
Thank you, Lorraine. I am Michelle Armster. I'm not trying to be snarky, so nobody thinks that there's any. Okay, and I'd like to start by offering an acknowledgement and a celebration, because it's important for me to acknowledge the history that brought my ancestors to this land. And I want to first acknowledge the original people, the indigenous people, who live and thrived for thousands of years on this land that they call Turtle Island. The land on which I live today is stolen land, and it is called the state of Kansas. However, Kansas is not the name of the original people. The original people were and are the Kaw. The city where I reside is called Wichita, after another indigenous people called Wichita. This land was and is home for the Sac and Fox, the Pawnee, the Cheyenne, and many others whose languages and people are no longer here because of genocide, extermination, disease, forced displacement. And these people, all these people, have families, communities, ways of being, and faith. And it's also important for me to acknowledge my ancestors, stolen people from Sierra Leone and Burkina Faso. Matrilineally, I am of the Mende tribe of Sierra Leone, and patrilineally, I'm of the Bisa tribe of Burkina Faso. We are not settlers, those of us who come as people who were enslaved. We are and were displaced people. Our bodies were stolen, and like the original people, our language was stolen, our identities erased, and we too had families and communities and faith. So I acknowledge and I celebrate that we are still here. And I believe when I acknowledge the legacy of the indigenous people, acknowledge their land was stolen, and when I acknowledge the legacy of my ancestors and acknowledge that they too were stolen, I defy the lie of white supremacy that values property and things over people. So we can celebrate that truth, that we are still here. Ashe. When we began this project, this writing project, I had received a request to write. A friend wanted me to write a chapter for this book. It's called Colorizing Restorative Justice. And I have always, I write, but I have always wanted to do writing collaboratively. I feel like it's important to provide a space for voices to be heard. I also wanted to write with other women of color who are in the field of restorative justice. And so Erica, she works in my office, And so I kind of yelled down the hallway and said, Erica, want to write with me? She said, sure. She didn't know what she was doing, but she said, sure. And then later I was on a conference call. Christianne will remember and will call exactly. And I saw this woman, this young, fabulous Filipina Canadian woman. And I said, okay, I want her to write with us. So I sent her a message, said, would you be willing to collaborate on a chapter? And she did not hesitate and said yes. So how Lorraine fits into it, we wanted to be collaborative, we wanted to be conversational, we wanted to really spend time, and we couldn't, knowing us, we couldn't talk and write at the same time. So we wanted someone that who we also admired and respect. And Lorraine Stutzman-Amstutz is a person that we all respect, and we consider her not an ally. She is an accomplice. She is a co-conspirator in this work. And that's what's important for us. And so I reached out to Lorraine and asked if she would be willing to just facilitate our conversations as best as she could, take notes about the conversation that the three of us were having. And so she agreed to do that. And out of that came we came together and wrote for 3 days. I can't remember. I'm not as young as the other two. We came together and wrote the chapter. And so the chapter that we have in the book is called Burn the Bridge. And the idea is that the field always talks about bridge building, but we want to challenge that it's not, that the bridge probably needs to be burned because of the assumptions around what this bridge is supposed to symbolize. And so that's how we came together, and that's how we formed the chapter. And our conversation tonight continues to be around what does it mean to be women of color in the restorative justice field, and how do we navigate that sometimes very unrestorative space, and how do we speak into what we believe is restorative, which is not the definition used by or practiced by many practitioners who are of the dominant culture. So thank you for coming tonight, and hopefully you will find something within our banter that you would hold on to and be inspired to pursue further.
I don't know if I would call it banter, Michelle. I think I would call it within the expertise that they're going to be listening to.
Right. So,
Erica, if you want to introduce yourself.
Oh, I always try to get serious and then they say something. I feel like I need to mute you guys' faces on the Zoom screen. My name is Erica Littlewolf. I am Northern Cheyenne. I live in southeastern Montana on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. So I live on a portion of my homelands. We were once occupied a huge piece of land, and now just occupy a small piece of land. And so I like to acknowledge the land that sustains my people and has always sustained my people. And not in terms of capital, not in terms of capitalism, in terms of the earth belongs in and of herself. She belongs to herself, and we rely upon her. And with that, in building of the American dream, the reliance upon stolen land, but also the realization of the stolen land in Africa of Indigenous people, and the enslavement of Indigenous people from Africa, and the movement of people to America, in which we get stolen labor. and that was used, stolen land, stolen labor, in order to build the American dream. And as we all know, that is not the American dream that is present for everyone. And so I would like to acknowledge both of those. And I tend to believe that we cannot heal what we don't acknowledge. And so my intention is to bring that into our consciousness, because as we know, these are not things of the past. We can see these systemic injustices very much playing out now in times of pandemic, where people of color, I just read a study yesterday where people of color are affected at much higher rates and die of COVID at higher rates. And that is not because we are biologically different. It is because we have been systemically oppressed for years upon years upon years. And it comes into the communities. And so, as if you read this book, Colorizing Restorative Justice, Edward Valandra always refers to the first harm, of stolen land. And so I think of, like those two harms, stolen land in Africa, stolen land in the US, and then the second harm of the enslavement of people of African descent. And so with that, I am happy to be here.
Thanks, Erica. Christianne.
I was about to start talking, and then I thought I could hear Erica's voice in my head. You're on mute. You're on mute. Christian tinagan ko paras ti apelyedok, anakak ti Ilocano na nanang, ken kamapangan nga tatam, nagapo kami dyan Ilocos Norte, Pilipinas. Kuna digita lola ken lolo mi, awan nga maisulsuro da data awan makatakaw ken ka. My name is Christianne Paras. My relations are from my Ilocano mother and Kapampangan father. We're originally from the northern region, Ilocos of the Philippines, by its colonized name. I am from the land of the Ilocanos, originally known as the Samtoy people, which comes from a saying in our language, Saomi Ibtoy. That translates to, we speak our language here. Our grandparents' wisdom tell us that knowledge is wealth that cannot be stolen. So a significant part of my journey and identity is also as an immigrant, a settler of color living and working on the ancestral, unceded stolen lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Coquitlam people where I reside. Honoring the land and indigenous people on this land that I now call home is incredibly important for all aspects of my identity. As a person of color settler coming from a land that has its own history of colonization, and now living here on Turtle Island, which has its own history of colonization and oppression and still occupied, I often ask myself, in what ways am I complicit in the systems that oppress indigenous peoples? Mm-hmm. And what work do I need to continually be doing to be a comrade, co-conspirator, and stand in solidarity with Black and indigenous peoples? So I'm constantly grappling with that. And one of the wonderful things that I've encountered in that journey and the work of Colorizing Restorative Justice has been to meet these beautiful women that I've been able to call friends, comrades, co-conspirators, and have been able to stand alongside them as we struggle for liberation. So I'm really happy to be here, excited to have these conversations again. And yeah, it's always fun and always lots of laughter, which is medicine. So yes. I look forward to that.
Thank you. So I want to say I'm Lorraine Stutzman-Amstutz. I'm happy to be here facilitating this conversation tonight. I also want to just acknowledge the land that where I currently sit, were the ancestral lands of a number of indigenous tribes, including the Susquehannocks, who were known in Lancaster County as the Conestogas, as well as the Nanacoke and Lenape people. And I also I want to pay my respect to their elders and to the elders past, the elders present, and to remember the many legacies of violence and displacement and migration and settlement that has brought us here to where we are. And I want to recognize that as I think about remembering all of this, that I also understand that it's a starting point, not an ending point. And I think of that particularly as someone from the dominant culture. And I think one of the things that acknowledging all this has also enabled me, you know, as someone from the dominant culture, as a white person, to be able to acknowledge my own work that I need to do and have done, and how for me that's as important as being able to acknowledge kind of the legacies of violence that I talk about and the impact that has also continues to have on me as a white person and the work that I need to do. So I am so grateful that in having these conversations, particularly around restorative justice, that I've been able to be a part of with these women, is that puts a lens on it for me in part of the work that I've been doing for decades, but suddenly puts a different lens on it for me looking at it. And so I'm just so honored that I've been able to be a part of this, and the time that we've spent together and having these discussions, that I feel like in many ways just honored to be part of that, rather than feeling like it wasn't something of my doing, it was their doing that I got to be sitting in on. So I'm delighted that we get to continue having these conversations like this. And so we're going to start, and I'm going to ask questions that they will each respond to in a particular order. And they know what that order is, but I am certainly here to remind them if anything happens as we go in that order. So I'm going to start by asking the question that Michelle will begin to answer. Where do you see restorative justice in responding to racial harm? Where is restorative justice at in that?
Not. Restorative justice is not in responding to racial harms. I think that the challenge has been with restorative justice, and I've been in the field for a number of years, when that race has never been something that would be acknowledged, when and whatever the case may be, that race has a place in it, gender, little more so, class, not at all, but definitely. So restorative justice has always articulated the field in a way that assumes, or you are supposed to believe, that the process takes care of all those mitigating contributions to whatever the situation is. So that's a challenge that I have and continue to have in restorative justice. Also recognizing that, you know, as restorative justice has become, more codified and commodified, it has also I've got to watch myself a little bit, because I don't want anything coming back on me later. But as it has been codified and commodified, it has also been, how would you say, co-opted by racist systems. So, you know, we talk about, part of the field has talked about responding to harms that involves the criminal justice system, for example. But how do you have a restorative process when the system is the offender? How do we have a restorative process when the system is the offender? And as restorative justice practitioners, you depend on the system to pay the rent. So that's problematic, and that continues to be challenging, even more so. My professor has written a book, Dr. Valerie Miles Tribble, called part of the title talked about being change agents in Black Lives Matter times. And that's the purpose of, that's the trajectory of her book. How do we use principles of restorative justice to restore communities, and yet the perpetrators, the offenders of the community are the systems that continue to oppress, deny access for, that's the challenge. That's the challenge. And I would say restorative justice has not responded.
Erica, you're following up.
That is hard to follow, but I will. I think, yeah, when I think of this, I think restorative justice could possibly have responded to racial harm on individual basis, as far as a person of color responding to an individual situation of racial harm. Maybe in a school setting, some student called another student a racially derogatory term, and maybe that has gone through some sort of process and got dealt with. But as far as the racism we're talking about, which is systemic, restorative justice, like, yo, where you at? It's just not there. And when I think about that, I think of the conversation Christianne facilitated yesterday with Joanna Turner. And she has a fabulous, she reminded me of a fabulous example, this video called Hollow Water, of a community in Canada that was affected by boarding school. And so they had high rates of sexual abuse in their community. And they did some restorative justice work. But if restorative justice, where it's at, mainstream restorative justice, were to go in and look at that, like the problems that come out because of sexual abuse, they would look at that as an individual case, right? They would look at it as someone that it has harmed and someone that has been harmed. And so how is this person that has harmed going to take accountability? And they would never look further and say, yo, this person that has caused harm has been harmed. They were harmed by the system that made and forced them to go to boarding school, in which they were abused at all levels by the government, by the priest, by the nuns, and there's no accountability there. And so as restorative justice stands now, it looks at that individual level of, and can you imagine, like, I mean, yeah, hell yeah, I can imagine. As individuals, we're taking on the burden of not only holding ourselves accountable, but as people of color, we're having to carry the weight of that system. Like, the system is harming us, and here we are being like, it's our fault. Like, it's our fault for this. And we're taking on all this responsibility. And so when you have a system like that, that's called restorative justice, like, that don't feel good. Like, I don't know how restorative that is. I don't know who walks out of that room feeling good, but maybe the facilitator. And so, yeah, that's where it's at now.
Thank you. Christianne, where is restorative justice in responding to racial harm?
I thought I knew how I was going to respond when I heard Michelle, and then Erica took it somewhere, and I was like, oh man, what am I going to talk about? Well, I echo and totally agree with everything that's been stated by Erica and Michelle. No, I don't think restorative justice is responding to racial harm at the moment. It is not responding to racial harm at a macro level. It's not responding to racial harm at a meso level or a micro level. So it's not doing it at any of those levels at all. And I think philosophically, I would love to hear from folks who took part in shaping and defining restorative justice in the dominant spaces, because I would highly doubt that they included racism as violence when they defined it, because it does not feel that way. And there's policies, there's models and practices, even skills that are offered as training in restorative justice that does not at all include ways in which we talk and dismantle racism, understand and recognize trauma through racialized experiences. And as a result of that, I think Erica's right. Like, we're talking about this systemically, but it's trickling down to those interpersonal relationships, because restorative spaces aren't safe for people of color. They are not truly seen. And I also would say that restorative justice has really has not developed to be able to hold space to talk about things that are difficult, talk about colonization, talk about stolen land, and the fact that this land was built on stolen bodies, and the fact that there's still oppression on various aspects of social institutions in our society. There's just no conversations around that. We continue, I think, in restorative justice to address these incidents as though they exist in a vacuum, and they do not. If I was to be assaulted, it's wrapped up in my identity as a woman of color, and I don't know if I would be able to talk about that in a restorative space. And that would be equally important to me to talk about that impact as it would be with the physical harm. And that is something that I wish that, could be better developed and even just address and acknowledge that that's just not there. And I think lastly for me, the biggest thing is that I have heard many practitioners of color talk about how they haven't felt like they could fully be themselves, and bring their cultural ways into restorative spaces. And most of us that practice in restorative justice, come from a trauma-informed lens. We know that the person's sense of self is fractured, is impacted deeply from harm, and so through trauma, that is a huge piece to healing. And if we're not acknowledging the lived experiences of people of color, then we're not making space for culture into those spaces. And so then where's cultural healing, the kind of healing that would be important for me as a woman of color? Could I ask for ceremony? Could I ask to speak my language in that space where the dominant language is what's spoken, and we are expected to come into that space being able to interact with whatever the dominant normative rules are. So I guess for me, those are the things that not only RJ struggles to address racial harm, but I think perpetuates racial harm. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Well, I really wish you all would be a little more honest, but I'm sure we'll get there. But you've set yourselves up perfectly for the next question. I will tell you that. So talk about what considerations or recommendations you have for restorative justice in responding to racial harm. What would you say in terms of those kind of recommendations or thoughts on that? Michelle?
Yeah, may I just say, Christianne, and unfortunately, Christianne triggered some thoughts for me, because one thing that was important was acknowledgement. I mean, the acknowledgement, and I really appreciated what you said, like, why can I not speak my language to tell my story, right? And you talked about rituals, because what has really been somewhat challenging for me is how the use of a feather has been co-opted in these processes. And I'm like, and then it becomes the thing that makes the circle a restorative justice circle. And that whole co-option, like, if you don't have your own stuff, then don't do it. I mean, it really is crazy making. Now, I use a stone in larger circles, and I got this stone when I was on the continent of Africa for my first time. And I just remember being there and remembering, oh my goodness, as long as I don't open my mouth, people, I look like everyone, I look like I belong here. And so I was there for a number of weeks, and before I left, I saw this stone, and it really called to me, and that stone of belonging, and so when I use that stone, I'm telling that story. That's the story. I'm not trying to co-op, usurp, and so that idea of rituals and I think the values that restorative justice espouses, I would suggest that we need to do some reflection on those values, like belonging, about like accountability, like community. Those words mean, I feel, for me as a woman of African descent and a womanist, those words mean something very different for me than it does for dominant culture and how it identifies in relationship to restorative practice. So let's talk about the proposed or the suggested values, and recognize that it really is complicated, that it really is nuanced, and that and how do we provide spaces for people to bring their whole selves as much as possible, because this is a journey. This is not an event. This is how do we bring our whole selves, and how do we allow space for that to emerge? Because the idea of safe space, I think, is a crazy notion, because for me, there's no space that is safe in terms of how we at this point, but I am willing to attempt to be brave when I go into these spaces, and so this expanse, I guess. So how would the challenge for restorative justice and restorative practice is to expand its understanding of what is restorative and what will restore, and how and what is needed, because that whole trust the process. When someone says trust the process, I want to say why, because it's who's in the room that makes a difference. The process is not the sacrosanct way of doing. And so there's language that I think is oppressive, that tends to silence, that there's language and ways of being that restorative justice perpetuates, that does not make it safe. And it really needs to look at itself, and it needs to hear from, and I'm just gonna put out there, it needs to hear from women of color. So.
She's dropping the mic after that one. Erica, to you, what recommendations or considerations do you have for restorative justice responding to racial harm?
I first want to say everyone needs to have smart friends that use words like sink to sink or
sacrosanct.
Sacrosanct. And then my new word this week was magnificat. or something like that. And like, wow, like I don't need to go get my doctorate. I got like all my friends writing books and stuff. So my considerations and recommendations, I like to think like tangible. And so I think, and I've answered this question before, and I will preface this again, because in the racial justice work I have done trainings with the host of this. What is this thing called? Webinar, Facebook Live, podcast. I don't know what I'm doing, but I have done racial justice trainings with this organization before. And what I have found is that white people usually tend to like to get these prescriptive lists of how can I fix this? And then they're like, well, how they're always asking people of color too, like, well, what can we do? Like, would you have suggestions? And the questions get trickier the more you don't answer it. And so then they're writing stuff down, and you find out that it's becoming a checklist, so that it fulfills this need that once the checklist is fulfilled, like then racial justice is complete. Not that easy. And so I think what I would rather do is like look at it as, you know, there's ways of being people are going to have to get used to. And one document I like is called White Supremacy Culture. And you can Google that, and it shows the way that white supremacy culture shows up. And it also gives antidotes of how to show up differently. And I think the more you get used to showing up differently, that will go way beyond, because a lot of things that need to change are processes, because you can see that these systems, when white people are in charge, you put a person in color, things don't change. It's because the system's still the dang same, right? It's like, even if you switch the color of the person, the gender of the person, the system is still the same. The system will always want to keep itself the same. And so what I think of in terms of restorative justice is to learn to ask the right questions. So many questions have been asked. Don't keep asking the same questions that have already been asked. Go and Google that stuff. Like Google, you can ask Google so many crazy things. Like even when you don't know how to ask the question, Google figures it out for you. And like start doing that. Yeah, Google rocks. And so like get your baseline work done. Take some systemic racism course. They are out there and they are online, and get that languaging down, and then start looking at something systemic, like what I was thinking of, and this is both in Canada and in the US. Could restorative justice look at, could they respond to Black Lives Matter and the violence that is happening? Could restorative justice respond to murdered and missing Indigenous women? And start looking at these systemic issues and looking at, could we? And so when you look at that, what would you need to do to be able to respond to those? You sure as heck need to look at a worldview of a culture. You need to look at cultural competency. How do people communicate through death? How do people communicate through silence? How do people do all these different mannerisms that you're not familiar with? And start learning that, because this is what I think we're being called into. Is I know people are like, I just seen an article. They're like, you know, the defund the police movement, and people are like, we're going to restorative justice. And I'm like, yo, we don't got it together either. So I don't know, you know, thinking, but that would be some of my recommendations. The systemic problems are out there. So start looking at them and seeing how you can respond. That's it.
Thank you, Christianne.
I don't even know how to follow that. Tangible things. Okay. Well, I think that there are many things that restorative justice could do. I think it begins with conversations um, around the power and privilege that exists in restorative justice. Power in who is the people that are perceived as experts, that have had the capacity, ability to define restorative justice, what restorative is, what it's restoring, who it's restoring, who gets to be referred to restorative justice, and even the way in which people are referred to restorative justice. I've heard the sentiments of, oh, this is a really good kid from a good family in a good neighborhood. And then I hear the other reasons for referring the exact same referral and be, you know what? I can't charge this kid. He gets into trouble all the time. And I've had so many run-ins with this kid. I'm going to send him to restorative justice because it's better than nothing happening at all. Those are the two exact scenarios. And yet there seems to be totally different narratives for different people. And that says a lot about the way the system is being used and utilized. And I think, the gatekeepers being the same to the justice system is the same to the restorative justice system. It's the principals, vice principals of schools, it's the police officers in our communities, right? And so if those ideas about stereotypes that exist about Black, Indigenous, and people of color, they're going to seep into those interactions. And, the system already exists based on that. So it's a really cyclical pattern, it's really, it just continues to perpetuate itself. And I guess for me, I think it's important for us to have those conversations around power and privilege. As Erica said, do the work. There are anti-racism, anti-oppression training out there. Dismantle, all of those notions that you have that perpetuate this dominant culture. And I would love for us to approach trauma, a trauma-informed lens, with the racial equity lens included. How are we addressing identity beyond the binary offender and victim? Renee Linklater, author of Decolonizing Trauma Work, I really love the quote. She says, if identity is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, then helping people connect with a community that is inherently cultural will help them heal their feelings of isolation and disconnection and contribute to healthier identities. And I really love that because it's recognizing the importance of that connection and that connection to the cultural piece. And so, those are two things that I think, I know that a lot of white folks often ask us all the time, whenever we're on these webinars, like, what's the solution? That's a constant question that we get. And that question perpetuates the problem. You being solution focused perpetuates the problem. Doing the work is continual and constant. Anti-oppression work is continual and constant. So if you think you got everything figured out, check again. That's when you don't know anything at all. So I just really feel like there has to be some humility in restorative justice. Maybe that's the first value that we need to hold. And then we'll be open to learning, and we'll be open to be curious and seeing and hearing from the lived experiences of people of color. So that's me.
Thank you all. I just want to acknowledge that we have about 15 minutes left. We're coming into our final question. Before I ask the final question, I also want to give an opportunity for those who are watching live on Facebook to just put your comments or questions that you may have there as you're watching, and they can be given to us, transferred to here on Zoom. So feel free to do that if you have any.
Lorraine, I wonder, considering how the three of us tend to talk, I think it's either we respond to questions if there are any, or we talk, but we can't talk and there be any time left, right? I mean, doesn't this go to?
There haven't, right, okay, there haven't been any questions yet,
Okay,
so.
Okay.
Not that they won't come in the next 2 minutes, and then I'll just have to tell you all, you have to be more brief so we can answer them.
Or you just have to cut us off.
Okay, did you all hear what she just said? Okay, so, okay, so for the final question, can you give examples of collaborative work that's emerging, being responsive and restorative to racial harm? What are some examples, other than clearly the work you're all doing?
Well, you know.
Sorry, did I just steal your thunder?
Yes, because that's exactly what it is. Because this Colorizing Restorative Justice project was that work that needs to happen. I think in the same line of Christianne's comment, like let's just step back and let's just try to go back to basics. And I think the Colorizing Restorative Justice is that project. I think challenging what it means to write collaboratively, honoring the diversity of voices and believing that the voices come together to have something rich, maybe complex, but it is coming out of a value that is not practiced often, and I think it's a value that that's what collaboration looks like, you know, is being able to write it in that manner. And I would also say that where I also see this happening is, if you're not invited to, we always wait to be invited to the table, you know, that whole analogy of being invited to the table. But you know what, we bring in our own doggone table and our own doggone chairs, and we're going to do this thing because we know we have it like that. You know, we know that we have something to offer, and if they don't want it, we're going to do it anyhow. So there's that empowerment, and it's not even that we recognize our power and our capacity and our creativity and our right to be heard and a part of this work. And so that for me is what's important in this day and time, is recognizing we instead of waiting to find, to be given a place at the table, we're just gonna have our own party.
Thank you. I do want to acknowledge one question that came in, whether there were any suggestions for bringing specifically the Philadelphia DA and prosecutors into this discussion, to RJ discussion. I know they've had a training, that's all I'm going to say. So I can tell you that, but if there are other suggestions that others have, then say it. So Erica, you can respond to the first question or the second one.
Okay, first, Lorraine, I would like to say that you did steal the thunder and the rain and the hail. And I could make it a really bad, like, white settler joke from there, but I'm not going to. And then I keep thinking of what Michelle said, like, about, like, we're going to bring our own table and our own chairs. And I'm just like, I'm bringing a lazy boy. And can we just be in the living room with a nice flat screen TV and some wings? Like, I don't need a table. Like, anyway, I got sidetracked and forgot that. Oh, collaboration. This always happens. Collaboration. Okay, so all I can, like, literally, Lorraine, you did it. All I can think of is, I'm not sure if you guys heard of this thing. It's called, this new book dropped. It's called Colorizing Restorative Justice. And so it's still pretty new, but it's an awesome collaboration. No, but yeah, Lorraine did steal the thunder. No, but I think the work is going somewhere, because we always talk about how we have been living on our own, thinking we were secretly crazy in our own heads, having our own conversations with our own selves. And now we're having conversations with each other. And so I think Belinda said yesterday that it started out as, like these conversations, and now it's like a movement. And so I only foresee it getting bigger. We talk about, all us authors, about how we are a CRJ family, and that we continue to have phone calls, and that we continue to connect around the work, and that people keep spiraling off. There keeps being podcasts and other webinars, and Christianne and I do our own work with, it's called Roots too, actually, but it's reclaiming our own truths and stories, where we continue this work because we just could not quit talking about it. And so I think that's a lot of what's happening in other of the authors that just keep building on it. And I think part of it is what it seems to be the theme is, and it happens in every field, is people of color, we get burnt out in our fields because we don't have spaces to have these kind of conversations. And I think what this has done is finding like-minded people having similar conversations. It's given us like a little energy shot. And so we're finding strength to continue the work and have the conversations we want to have and do the work we want to do. And so I just say keep looking out, because the work is just going to continue and keep spiraling off in different directions. And it's creative work and it's life-giving work. And so I find that to be exciting, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
Thank you. See, I did not steal your thunder. You had amazing thunder on your own. Christianne.
All right, this is the point in the conversation where I do forget the question. What was the question that we're supposed to be answering again?
Giving an example of ways that you have collaborative work that's emerging in the context of being responsive and restorative within racial harm.
Well, I definitely think that Colorizing Restorative Justice has been a really pivotal moment, both personally and professionally for me. The continued collaborations with the four of us, but also working alongside Erica now, and also getting a chance to work and collaborate with the other authors who are incredible and amazing and just doing incredible work. And so I feel like that's been a big piece of that kind of work that I hope to continue holding up. I also would be I'm always lost for the proper words, but I would be remiss to not mention a really amazing program that I think is a wonderful example of this. There's an organization in Ottawa who works specifically with the Inuit urban population. The name of the organization is Tungasuvingat Inuit, and they are incredible. I just have been really privileged and honored to be, to be a part of their early steps in forming their restorative justice organization. But I remember when I joined them for a training, they were training the diversity unit of the Ottawa Police to work alongside them in ensuring that there was a real alignment and congruence in the way that they were going to offer restorative spaces and processes for the Inuit community there. And I think that that's just a wonderful example of like doing good work and doing work in consultation with the indigenous people that are there in that space, and giving space to developing that process authentically. So I want to mention them because they're incredible, and I'm excited to hear more about the work that they continue to do. But yeah, I feel like those are the two best examples of some of the work that's happening right now.
Thank you. We do have just a couple of minutes left. And so just want to ask you if you have any final words that you want to share, Michelle, then Erica and Christianne, before we say goodnight.
Not really. I just really, again, always appreciate hanging out with these young ladies, and each conversation, although we kind of frame it similarly, it's like every time we come together, it's something new, and I continue to learn. And so I think that's one of the things that I think is important: intergenerational conversations and interactions, because as long as you're sitting upright, you can learn. And so it's important for us to recognize the wisdom that's in a place. And thank you very much. I always enjoy these conversations with you.
I think the one thing I have is just reflecting on my week this week. I saw a thing on social media about how comparing like indigenous thoughts around the planet to people wanting to address climate change, and how people would say, oh, this is similar, and yeah, me too. And then I just totally got body slammed, because what I had forgotten, and what the point of the whole meme series, I made that up, was to say, what's being forgotten, what's being left out is this entire worldview of indigenous people that predates, that comes up and is the backing to this thinking that this modern climate change movement doesn't have. And so I think I've been trying to think about, how does that apply to restorative justice? What does that mean? And different things like that. And then where do you push the line of cultural appropriation? And so I think that's probably an eventual conversation, because I know when people get freaked out over like white supremacy culture and they start realizing it, then they want to do, like Michelle pointed out, like that flip. And I think the flip in restorative justice tends to be to Native culture, and then it becomes like that appropriation. And so I feel like those conversations are probably coming sooner rather than later. And so I guess trying to think back, trying to put that back into some context as well. And thank you for inviting us. Thank you for inviting me. It is always fun to be a part of these spaces.
Christianne.
Well, I'm so glad that I got to be part of another event by Roots of Justice. Really amazing organization. First organization that I got involved with to talk about anti-Asian racism, and then this conversation. So just amazing work. I guess for me, I just really, really want to encourage folks to continue doing the work, and to not allow the pendulum to swing back to that status quo, to continue the disruption, the dismantling that we're doing, and to continue questioning and being open to being these conversations, even if there's discomfort, to continue questioning. And I guess for me, I just want to, rather than asking what are the solutions, the immediate solutions, the immediate band-aid responses that will allow us to feel better that we've done something, perhaps what we can ask is, in this time of change, in this time of calling out and calling in, and trying to make real systemic change, how do we transform these systems with permanence? And that's an important question. And so I think we need to swing that question about quick solutions to that instead. So that's just my final thoughts for everyone. And so thank you very much for listening. And thank you again, Roots of Justice, for inviting us to be part of this conversation.
It's been an honor to be with you all. Yes, thanks to Roots of Justice for inviting this conversation. We wish you all well and have a great evening.